All right, Dr. Lisle, how's it going today?
Good, good. Good to hear your voice again, Nate.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, another day, another week, another year. Today is the longest day of the year, June
Uh-huh.
21st, and I think the summer is upon us. This is where the
I
sun sets pretty late for us.
Yes, absolutely. You're I'm sure very hot down there in Los Angeles.
Yeah, Southern California has two main seasons: warm and warmer,
And that's it. You've
and
officially
that's it.
started warmer.
Yeah,
There you
I
go.
used to meet people from Midwest and other places, and they were always just jealous how we only have how we only have two seasons.
Yeah.
But
And my
sometimes the four seasons can be helpful.
yeah, my dad, I grew up in Southern California, and my dad, who was a real estate guy, would rub his hands together whenever the Rose Bowl was on, and it was 72 degrees on January 1st. He'd be like, "Good, good. More people, more people are going to move in," and that is certainly what has happened. No doubt.
Yeah. All right. Well, we've got a couple of articles today. I was reading
Hmm.
a couple of different things on Facebook and the news, and I came across an article from The Guardian.
Hmm.
So obviously
Hmm.
we all know where that is going. But The Guardian, they had an article that says that there's reporting on a study that found the following: that older men tend to have, quote, geekier sons who are more aloof, have higher IQs, and more intense focus on their interests than those born to younger fathers. So
Hmm.
they did a study with about a little less than 8,000 British twins, and they
Yeah.
scored according to their nonverbal IQ at 12 years
Hmm.
old. And then parents reported also how focused and socially aloof they were. Then they
Hmm.
combined this in what they called a geek index.
Hmm.
And they
Hmm.
found that children born to older fathers tended to score higher on this index. So, for example,
Hmm.
if the father was 25 years old or younger, the average score was 39. But if he was
Hmm.
35 to 44, the score was 41. And then if he was over 50, the score was 47. So the
Hmm.
study's
Hmm.
author said that this is the first study to suggest that having an older father can have benefits for a child. But
What kind of idiot makes that inference? Yeah, I'm going to hack
Right,
that up in
right. It
about
was
two
interesting
seconds.
because
Go
I thought,
ahead.
no, maybe it's that more aloof, more socially aloof fathers tend to just have kids later on in life because they're just not as
Of course.
successful. Um,
Yeah.
but they found that 57% of this geek index score is inherited. That
Hmm.
was likely going to vary with age, and it suggests that DNA and the environment have roughly an equal share in how geeky, quote, someone turns out. And of course, the final statement from the study author, she said the following: certain men who delay fatherhood tend to be better educated and have better jobs and a higher geek index. And so they pass those genetics into their offspring.
Yeah,
So it
finally.
causes them
Yeah,
to
well,
delay
first of
fatherhood, but other factors might contribute too.
oh my God, that's hilarious. So this is great because this is an example of yeah, they finally got their act together, but clearly this is obvious what's happening here. So what's happening is obviously geekier, less socially skilled men are clearly, and they're smarter, so they're taking their time amassing some resources. Finally, they get laid. You know what I mean? Starting at about age 40, which is certainly reminiscent of my
Oh, good,
history.
good. I have 8 years left.
Okay. So finally, they might start to get a little bit of action. And so finally somebody says, all right, house looks good enough, car looks good enough, pension looks good enough, and you don't look like you're completely falling apart, and you look like you've got some security. Okay, maybe. So then they finally get lucky, and they have a kid. And that kid turns out to be remarkably like the father. And we start the whole game all over again with the next generation. So this is obviously what's happening, and I think it's hilarious that they say that 57% is inherited and 43% is what do you call it, learned or environment. This is not true. They're misinterpreting their data. 53% of it is directly attributable to genes. 43% is not attributable to anything. Okay, so this is the classic mistake that that has gone in the reading of the literature in behavior genetics since the 1980s, when Abe Telligent and his crew and Robert Plomin and guys like this figured out that the genes were dominating the show. And so because the genes can account for somewhere around half of the measurable variance, the other half is unexplained. And so what happens is that the social development researchers are quick to say, oh, well, then the other half's the environment. It's like, well, not exactly, sports fans. The other half is unexplained. And so when they go into trying to study environmental influence to try to look for any systematic impact of the environment, they don't find anything. Okay, so they might find, 1 or 2% of the variances might be associated with birth order. That's about where that stacks up. There is no other. There's no imitative function that's involved. So the kids don't become geeky by watching their geeky fathers. It turns out if you were to look at this and you put them in with, you had them adopted into homes with cool young fathers, they would be just as geeky by being adopted with cool young fathers as they were being raised by their geeky 50-year-old fathers. Now, so the question is, where does the other 50% of the variance comes from? The other 50% of the variance is unexplained variance, and Steven Pinker in The Blank Slate argues that a great deal of the unexplained variance probably has to do with random factors taking place in utero. So if you have two identical twins in utero, their genes are identical, but when you look at them 30, 40 years later, you're going to explain 50 or 60% of the variance in their behavior straight by the genes. In other words, they're very similar people, but they're not identical people when it comes to personality measurements or IQ. They're very close, but they're not identicals. And the reason has always been the social developmental people say, see, half of the variance is the environment. Yes, but probably a great deal of the, quote, environment, in fact, probably of the remaining 50% of the variance to be explained, it's quite likely at least half of it has to do with variances of the biological ecology or the chemical ecology of the uterus, and which kid was sitting on the left of the uterus and which kid was sitting on the right. And so these are variances that have obviously nothing to do with the concept of the, quote, environment that the social development people are trying to sell as explaining, quote, half of the variance in the equation. So this is once again a study that, at least for a rare study we're now starting to see that a study like this, at least somebody is considering the genes. I have to tell you, when I was in school and thereafter, in the 1980s, 1990s, and in the 2000s, people would continue to do social development studies of this kind, and then what finds its way to the press and even out of the discussions is, oh, see, older dads are geekier, and so they're, you heard what they said, there's some benefit to having your kids sooner. It's like, really? Yeah. You completely missed what the evidence just told us. Okay?
Right,
so
correlation, causation.
And so obviously this is a beautiful study in behavior genetics. And we can see the pathway of exactly how this outcome transpired. So fantastic study, Nate. I'm glad you brought our attention to it. Good stuff.
Cool. Yeah, it seems like they were grasping at straws trying to justify their position, which is that, well, at least environment's got something to do with it. So it's just scaling back.
Right.
You know, first it was 100-0 for environment, then it was 80-20, and now it's 50-50. So.
Yes, and it's 50-50 that we can't really defend, but we can sort of half-ass defend it. So, yeah, that's exactly right.
Mm-hmm. Okay,
All
another
right,
study.
What else do we have?
Another cool study. So some evidence in the Evolutionary Psychology Journal suggests that a lot of physical, behavioral, and trait qualities, they can actually be detected just by the sound of a person's voice, regardless of what they're saying. And so this particular study, it just came out a couple months ago. They examined whether people could accurately assess the likelihood that a person has cheated on committed romantic partners simply by hearing the speaker's voice. So they rated, they heard voice samples, they self-reported that they either cheated or had never cheated. And they controlled for the aspects that might clue a person to the speaker's mate value by making sure that they were same for voice attractiveness, for age, for voice pitch, and other acoustic things. And they found that, yes, indeed, participants who rated the voices of those who had a history of cheating were more likely to cheat, or had been more likely to be the ones who were cheating. And so this was really cool because regardless of pitch manipulation, they were able to assess accurately the history of infidelity. Now, the only exception was that the men's accuracy decreased when judging women whose voices were lowered. So maybe that's why when girls go to the bathroom all together, they hush their voices, you know, and maybe there's an evolutionary reason there.
This is actually really interesting. And so, you could send me a link to this thing. This is, so I want to see what they controlled for and how they did it. But this is, so I'm wondering what it is that they're finding there. And it sounds to me like, is what they're saying is that they can tell that essentially the almost the sexual personality or the sexiness of the people, and then that is that what they think is related to whether or not they're cheating, or we think that we're picking up acoustical evidence of conscientiousness or openness?
What they were trying to pick up is they found that statistically people who are more extroverted are more likely to engage in infidelity. Same thing with low conscientious and high agreeable. Low agreeable. So they were just picking up these cues.
Yes. Very good. Fantastic.
They controlled for the sexiness of the voice.
They controlled for the sexiness, but then they were picking up acoustical of disagreeable conscientiousness, and the other one was what, openness? Extroversion. Yeah, actually, this goes along the lines of, I think, I've said this before and other times, that there's a suspicion that obviously there's tremendous benefits to being an extrovert, of which I have gotten none of these benefits. Not a single such benefit, because I'm very introverted. However, what's interesting is that we think that the reason or an important reason why there may be a bell curve about which we still have relatively introverted people, only relative to humans. Humans are very, very social. But the reason why there may be a bell curve around introversion, extroversion is that the extrovert's success may be being checked by a coevolution of venereal disease. And so this study is actually consistent with that. So extroverts that are more likely to engage in extra-pair copulations would have been also more likely to ultimately be yielded as infertile by venereal disease. So this could have been the reason, could have checked human beings in the same way that ecological forces have checked humans in many ways. They're going to check your physical size and strength and et cetera, et cetera. So even though it's useful for males to get big and strong, we find out that, as we saw earlier in a study that you talked to us about earlier in the last year, Nate, that as men get extremely big and strong, they are less physically attracted to females, which is fascinating. In other words, they literally are showing too much size and strength, and at that point, for whatever reasons, the females rate them as less attractive. So there is a sweet spot.
They don't want their daughters to look like clunkers.
Yeah, they don't want to look their daughters to look like football players, and so that's probably what's taking place there. And also just that much testosterone way out over the line probably is probably going to drive a high degree of disagreeability, impulsivity, dangerousness, and also low fidelity. So and also essentially insisting on their way in the relationship. So there's costs associated with this, and so this is an example of that there's a sweet spot for optimizing a characteristic, and the sweet spot for males is 6 foot and 180 pounds, that whatever that is, right in that range, and mesomorphic, solid mesomorphic, and for personality characteristics, the sweet spot is going to be on the, open and relaxed and confident, emotionally stable, and in the middle of the road for introversion, extroversion. And but it is interesting that we're picking up the characteristic that we would think that we would pick up, which is that extroverts are sleeping around more often, and therefore we would, in principle, expect that if that were true, if you really think about this from a mathematical, population genetics aspect, if that is true, which it appears that it is true, you would then expect it to be the case that extroverts would be that the species would consistently be drifting towards an increasingly extroverted species. And I don't know that that's true, but it's probably not true. And so if it is not true, then that means it has hit an equilibrium because there's a selection pressure the other direction, and the selection pressure the other direction is very likely to have been venereal disease. So there we have it. Great little study. Nice little fascinating little piece of evolutionary psychology. Great stuff. Thank you for bringing that to our attention.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it also falls in line with something that we've discussed on the show earlier, which is that men are more anxious about women cheating because of the paternal investment. And it turned out that in the surveys, men reported women as being women reported men as being more likely to cheat than the other way around, even though it wasn't necessarily true.
Interesting.
So, yeah.
All right.
Okay. So we've got a couple of questions from our listeners, as usual, and we're going to try to get to as many as we can. And if we don't get to them, we will get to them another show. Okay. So first, number one, from our listener, are women on average more emotional than men? And if so, what's the evolutionary reason for this?
It's a very good question, and I actually don't know the answer to it. In principle, on the face of it, I wouldn't expect that to be true. However, there are reasons to expect that it may be true, and then there are reasons behind that where it would be evolutionarily plausible for it to be true. So someone may know. I have just never come across research or that question attack from the standpoint of an evolutionary theorist, but it may have been, so I just haven't seen it. Now, the issue of women being more emotional, the strongest argument from the standpoint of any kind of data that I can recall was a clinical psychologist, actually an academic by the name of Susan Nolan Hoeksema, was writing in the 1980s. I think she got her PhD at the University of Pennsylvania, and so she was writing along the lines of a more cognitively oriented theory, and she was very interested in depression. And the University of Pennsylvania is a hotbed of research and theory on cognitive behavioral treatments for depression. So she was sort of trained out of that group. That Aaron Beck was the godfather of cognitive therapy, and so that Pennsylvania has been influenced under the umbrella of that thinking. So Nolan Hoeksema then wrote about this, and one of her findings that she was reporting was that women were a lot more depressed than men. And as I recall, I think her reports were that women were twice as often to be diagnosed as depressed, etc. Now, I was very surprised by this, and I wasn't even thinking about this in evolutionary terms at the time. But I remember my BS meter went off in my head. I was in grad school, and I thought that just doesn't make any sense to me, that would be true. And in retrospect, I have a number of questions about this. One of them could be the case that remember that women are very often in positions in dominance hierarchies in general. Women are going to be often lower in the dominance hierarchy than a male, or at least in a situation where they are essentially they're in much more what looks like a parent-child relationship to some degree. they're in often positions of weakness, and this is not for one reason just size and strength differences, and another issue is going to be differences in the relative investments that they have in offspring. So males can defect and will defect more often out of relationships. So this is going to put females in a relative position of weakness oftentimes. Now, it wouldn't surprise me if a defense against that position could be greater expression of essentially childlike expressions that would be then more resulting in potentially paternalistic, altruistic instincts in the male that might be in a relationship with them. So let me give you an example of where it is that I think we would see this would be true. So think about a woman in a conflict with her boss, and who do you think is more likely to cry in the boss's office in order to be able to get home and deal with her kids, or to deal with she's so upset with Susie over an accounting and et cetera? Who's more likely to cry? Is it the female, or is it a male that's going to go cry to his male boss? Okay, so I think we know what the answer to this is. And so the question would be, why would we see this behavior, a crying behavior, so much more often, so much more obviously publicly in a female than a male? And the answer would be that it would be essentially a negotiating and manipulative tactic, and it would be a tactic that would be consistent with being in a subservient position, and therefore attempting to activate in order to fight back from the subservient position to try to get a more fair or equitable outcome. It would make sense to try to activate paternalistic and therefore altruistic or parentalistic cues. In other words, try to activate those mechanisms in the person on the other side of the table. So in this case, it could be the case that women, with respective expressions of these emotions, it might make sense that women would be more expressive than males. Males, it could be more evolutionarily costly to actually display these kinds of things because it would indicate a weakness that might cost them in terms of sexual selection. So I can definitely see how the expression of emotion and therefore the feelings of emotion, particularly these types of emotions, frustration, depression, etc., could be quite different between males and females. The expressions of emotions generally may be less differentiated. So laughter, smiling, happiness, etc. These might be significantly different. I mean, they may not be nearly as different. But it is possible that, and it appears to be the case, that when photographs are taken of males on Match.com like sites, it turns out that males are judged more attractively if they are not smiling. Now, this is very interesting. This indicates, God forbid, any pictures I've ever had on there were smiling, just like the goofy, friendly beta male that I am. Exactly what has always gone on. All right. So
but my geek index is higher than your geek index. Is that how we measure things now?
That's how we measure things now. That's our only hope to compete on that index. Now, I think that so anyway, it is interesting that females find males who are not smiling, as attractive. And so it wouldn't surprise us then if the expression, now who knows what is going on inside the nervous systems and how intensively the nervous systems are activating, feeling systems, etc. But short of that, we can at least measure the expression of emotion and even potentially, for example, the variance in voice tone and how expressive and dynamic voice tone is to indicate how emotional people are under different conditions. And it would not surprise me if there's a difference on average between males and females between these various dynamics. So in other words, some of these things have been observed, but I don't know of a coherent discussion about male and female emotionality differences by an evolutionary psychologist. Somebody may be able to boot it up online and find one. I've just never seen it. But that would be my thinking at this point. I think males are probably more likely to be less reactive, not laughing as easily, i.e. not giving up the status to somebody else as easily, and more have a little bit more of a cold and a little less reactive or less dynamic emotional state, and certainly less likely to display evidences of frustration through crying and therefore submissive behavior.
Fascinating. And so you're saying that that emotional stability is that there's no genetic component. Is in essence, are women less stable than men, or vice versa?
Right. I'm saying I don't know, and I don't know. Okay. On the emotional stability dimension. I don't know if there's differences in males and females. That's what this question really is.
Right.
And I think that what we may find is that we have to get inside and talk about specific emotions. Mm. And so it may be more finely grained than just emotionality in general. It may be specific emotions maybe have been sexually selected for greater or lesser reactivity.
Mm-hmm. Well, next time someone's speeding and you get pulled over by a police officer, we'll see who gets out of the ticket. Yeah, it won't. Yeah, the crying. It's not going to be me, that's for sure.
No, you and I crying isn't going to get it done. All right, let's go on.
Okay, our next question: are beliefs like religion and politics hardwired by our evolutionary past? And if not, can our beliefs become hardwires into our brains?
Okay, first of all, no, your beliefs cannot become hardwired into your brains. In fact, the concept of hardwiring is kind of a funny concept in general. The hardwiring, just to actually explain this in a certain amount of depth so that we all can be confident that we actually understand the underlying principles that are being questioned here, or so that in other discussions of hardwiring, you actually have a clear conceptualization of what on earth we're really talking about. I want you to think about sort of three. You got a piece of paper, and you're going to have three columns, and in the very middle column, we're just going to have one thing. We're going to call that G, and that's going to be the gene. And the gene will build a specific. That's a gene for something. So let's suppose that in principle this is the gene for how light or dark your skin is. Okay. So then on the left column, what we're going to do is we're going to call that environmental variance. So we're going to label that for E1 down to E10. Okay. So E1, E2, E3, E4, E5 down to E10. Those are going to be demarcations of 10 different levels of the amount of sunshine that a person is going to get in a day. Okay, and then on the so 10 will be the massive. You live at the equator. You're up at dawn. You're out there naked all day long. Okay, and you never stand under a tree. In other words, you get the maximum amount of sunlight possible for a human being on your skin. So that would be E10. E1 is you live in a cave and all you have is a 25-watt light bulb, and they shove food under your door. Okay, you never see the sun. That's E1. So then there's everything else in between. So those different, we're going to say 10 different levels are impacting, or those are environmental inputs that are hitting the genetic code. They're hitting the genes that are sitting inside the skin cells. Now, then what we're going to see is we're going to have a row on the right, and the row on the right is going to be what we're going to call phenotype 1 through 10. In other words, that's the outcome. I'm just using a fancy word, phenotype. In other words, genotype, that's your genes, that's the genetic code. Phenotype is what you actually see. So your genotype is sitting inside your genetic code inside your cells. your phenotype is you. That's the whole person with ears and eyes and tongue and teeth and all that kind of stuff. Those are phenotypes, and genotypes is the genetic code itself. So the phenotype 1 through 10 in this case is going to be what happens at each level of environmental input to the output that we're seeing. So we have an E1 hits the gene, and then what do we wind up with? We wind up with phenotype 1, which is the skin that person would have. We go to E2, which is the first level of real live sun. That hits the gene, we get phenotype 2. Now we see what that person's skin looks like under those conditions, and all the way down. Okay, so the concept of so now we see the concept of this is the concept of what we call reaction range in genetics. So we're seeing how wide is the reaction range of this particular gene. So in the particular gene of a typical person for their skin, if you're an Anglo-Saxon, you have fairly wide dynamics of let's suppose you're an Anglo-Saxon, but you have a grandmother that is from Guatemala, so you got a little more pigment in the skin. So now it's going to turn out you may have fairly high reaction ranges. In other words, from phenotype 1 to phenotype 10, you might be able to get pretty darn dark. Whereas if it turns out that you didn't have a grandmother from Guatemala, that all of your ancestors came from the north of Scotland, it could be that no matter how much sun you get, you're going to be either white or pink and nothing in between. Okay, so this is going to be what we call the reaction range of the phenotype on how dynamic the gene's action can get. Now, the concept now we're going to move that very same concept, but we're going to move it into neuroscience. So we're going to look at neurons, and in particular, we're going to look at people's thinking. Okay, so we're going to say, well, is something hardwired? Okay, is your personality hardwired? Is your religious beliefs hardwired? Is this or that hardwired? Well, what are we talking about here? What we're talking about is what is the reaction range of the phenotype given a diversity of environmental inputs? That's what we're talking about. So in the case of, for example, eye color, the reaction range is extremely narrow. In other words, I guess some people's eyes do change color, maybe dependent upon environmental inputs. I don't know if the environmental inputs have anything to do with it. But most of us, your eye color doesn't change much. And so the reaction range of eye color in general is unbelievably narrow. Okay, so that's how that works. The reaction range of IQ, dependent upon what inputs come in from the environment, is very small. So you're really not going to influence somebody's, quote, general intelligence very much at all. It doesn't matter if you have baby Einstein hanging over their crib. It doesn't make any difference. You will have essentially no impact on children's IQ dependent upon what sets of experiences you give them. Now the question is, what about something like religion or some other? So you can see now. So the question is, could a gene be set up for a belief system that it would say, well, given a certain amount of environmental inputs, can it be the case that I have a belief about something that the phenotypic outcome is not variable? In other words, it's not dynamic and it can't change with new inputs. And the answer is no. You can always change your mind. Okay, the mind has the ability to change its thinking depending upon the evidence, and also depending upon the cost-benefit analysis that's related to the inferences that are involved. And I'm going to explain that in a minute. So let's look at things like, I guess the question was what, religion and politics and things like that. Now, typically, if we looked at something like politics, that would be a good example, and religion is also a good example. That the things that are going to cause people to believe the things that they believe is going to be, first of all, they're going to be thinking through and trying to figure out the truth. So they have in their brains the ability to try to integrate data according to the law of non-contradiction. And so they're going to be trying to think these things through and make sense. And they'll come up with something, somebody will give them an explanation, And their brain will attempt to integrate that information, and it may or may not find contradictions in that analysis, and let's suppose it seems reasonable. Now, the thing is that is this the explanation as to why people believe what they believe? Well, partially this is true. In other words, they're making inferences that make sense to them. However, it's also going to be the case that with respect to certain of these things, their genetically laid-in personalities are going to cause them to have different types of opinions of things that make sense. So you can imagine, for example, that if you were low conscientiousness, then you might be more apt to have less. You got a little less interest in a conservative political philosophy, because the notion is here that low conscientiousness would just as soon have other people kind of cover for them in a social welfare kind of a situation. So we should expect to find that in general, people that are going to be more conservative are going to score higher on conscientiousness scores generally, and that is generally true. Okay. Incidentally, for all my liberal friends out there, this means nothing about you. Okay. These are population statistics that we're talking about. We're trying to see how it is that people wind up thinking what they think. Now, it's also going to be the case that people are going to, for example, we know that 13 out of 14 children believe in the religion that their parents believe. So this clearly is telling us that environmental impact is having a tremendous influence on the outcome. So this really, talking about something that doesn't look hardwired, we're looking at, the ecological circumstances are having a big influence here. Now, what are we seeing? We're seeing that people are learning about a bunch of complex information and theory about how things ought to be and how things came to be from people that they really trusted, and that they had no reason to believe were trying to pull the wool over their eyes or trying to essentially feed them anything that wasn't true. And so it's going to turn out that as they grow up and they listen to other religious perspectives, those other religious perspectives do not answer the questions that may come up to them in terms of sniffing contradictions in their own religious upbringing. Those other answers aren't any better, and so therefore they don't jettison them. Now, there's also something else that's going on, and that is that people, the brain is not necessarily designed simply to try to figure out the truth through making inferences, integrating data according to the law of non-contradiction. It is the brain's ultimate purpose is survival and reproduction. It is not actually seeking of the truth. It seeks the truth usually in almost all circumstances, because the truth is true, and therefore the truth is the identification of the relationship of the person between themselves and reality, and therefore if you're going to predict and control outcomes in reality, you are going to want to know what the truth is. So therefore the brain is largely wired to seek the truth, and it is wired to actually be uncomfortable and unhappy with situations where it doesn't quite fit, and it causes cognitive dissonance in the system. However, ultimately, once again, the brain's job is not to figure out the truth. The brain's job is to try to figure out how to survive and reproduce. And so it's going to turn out that the main conduit of resources that people need in order to survive and reproduce are not them vis-a-vis physical reality. It's them vis-a-vis the psychological realities of other human beings. So because most of our cost-benefit analysis about most of the variances in our resource management decisions about survival and reproduction have to do with other people and our relationship to other people, it's going to turn out that if other people have a wacky idea, then it's going to be in the brain's best interest to believe in the wacky idea if it gets you laid, okay, and if it gets you not kicked out of the group. So it's going to turn out this is now going to help us understand why 13 out of 14 kids believe what their parents believe. It's going to turn out that the brain is going to scan the situation and it may sniff all kinds of contradictions in the story of how the earth came to be, and why we're all here and what we're doing, and what God said and all this sort of jazz. So in other words, it may, particularly a smart person may start sniffing contradictions that it doesn't like the feel of. However, the brain's designed by nature to run a cost-benefit analysis on what it is that we should be believing if it's going to optimize our survival and reproductive success. And it may very well come up with the right answer of the, quote, right thing to believe is going to be to believe what everybody else believes. Okay? So this is not hardwired. What's hardwired is, or what is not variant in the system, is the fact that the system is designed by nature to optimize survival and reproductive success. That means it's going to be flexible about what it believes to be true, depending upon what other people in the environment believe to be true. And so this is now explaining where human beings are flexible with respect to their beliefs and why they will demonstrate a remarkable inflexibility even in the face of extraordinary evidence that basically would contradict their position. So the questioner that asked, are these beliefs hardwired or they become hardwired? The answer is no, they don't. But they sit under ecological constraints. Their personal ecological circumstances will drive stability, even in the face of tremendous evidence that position should be jettisoned logically. So that is why it can look hardwired, but it is not. If suddenly all the women in the church that you're trying to get laid in suddenly become atheists, the bright person who is suspecting maybe he didn't quite believe in this whole thing might have an epiphany. Okay, so this is so in principle that's how the brain actually works around these issues.
I guess that's how astrology got invented as well, I'm sure.
And is maintained, I have to tell you.
Yeah.
My belief in astrology is a direct correlation of how attractive the female is on the other side of the table. Okay, all right.
All right.
Right
our last question for this evening. This has to do with Jeffrey Miller's book called Spent. And it talks about the personality characteristics. He calls them the central six. You call them the big 5 plus 1. It's all the same. But he says in his book, Dear Dr. Lisle, Jeffrey Miller says in his book that in the developed world, emotional stability predicts overall life satisfaction more strongly than does income or any of the other personality characteristics. And so this listener is asking, Dear Dr. Lisle, I fall into the lower than average group for stability, and I was wondering if you could recommend any strategies to beat the genes in this scenario. I recognize that we are somewhat range-bound in just how much we can change. I currently minimize dietary stimulants like caffeine, trigger foods like sugar and processed junk, and depressants like alcohol. Are there any other effective strategies? I've been quite resistant to learning more about meditating, but if it really does work, I'm willing to give it a shot. But if there's other ways, that would be preferable.
Oh, that's a good question. It's a very good question. All right. So first of all, we're going to go back to we're going to look at an underlying an unchallenged inference that is sitting inside the question and is sitting inside of Miller's commentary. Now, first of all, I don't know that Miller's commentary is correct. So I don't believe that any finding that he's quoting there is very robust. So I don't think it's likely to be true that income predicting outcomes versus emotional stability is that I doubt that it is the case that emotional stability is a better predictor than income of life satisfaction. So I would question that, and I have reason to believe that Miller is probably essentially he could be not quite fairly presenting that evidence because the entire book Spent winds up towards a point that Miller is trying to make, and so he essentially is trying to say that money shouldn't be such a big deal. We should not have the current world based on a dominant hierarchy of financial success, and therefore everybody ought to be displaying in different fashion other than income. Now, I am enormously respectful of Jeffrey Miller. I believe he is a brilliant mind. He's not just smart. He's really special. But that doesn't mean that I can't disagree with him, and that there aren't times when his own biases and his own possible issues or his own just perspective can get him wandering off into the weeds. And so in this case, we're not going to take the bait. So first of all, I would say that as a clinical psychologist, the most important thing that you need to be thinking about with respect to your life satisfaction has nothing to do with your personality. It has to do with success. You're designed by nature to have your moods shifting in terms of your moods are dynamic, and your happiness is a dynamic process. And it is dependent upon cues that are coming either from your internal audience watching your efforts or from outside people actually giving you feedback about whether or not you are competitive with respect to your competitors in terms of trying to secure and maintain relationships across work, love, and human relationships that you find valuable. And so what counts is success. That's what you need to be focusing on. So income is one factor when it comes to professional success. It's not the only factor. Hitmen are quite successful. There are doctors that defraud Medicare. They have high incomes. I wouldn't expect these people to be particularly happy. In other words, their income is not the only variable. The tagline on my website is happiness results from earning esteem in the right way from the people that matter. Okay, and that is where we want to keep our focus. So I'm not going to. So for example, don't take the bait from Spent that basically says don't bother in achieving financial success. What you ought to do is try to learn to play the fiddle and paint, and then people will think you're cool. And that's a better way to display your low gene mutation load. Unfortunately, the world isn't buying it. And so income is a very significant and very reasonable way for people to be attempting to display their genetic fitness. It isn't the only way, and it isn't the only way that people look. And I would agree with Miller that it can be a better life to expanding your range of displays out. Learn to shoot a bow and arrow, play the fiddle, play basketball with your friends. Become a makeup guru and have your friends come over and show them how to do things. There's other ways other than just save up all your money and try to build a big house and wow everybody with how many square feet you have. There, of course, I understand the point that he's making, but from my standpoint, don't bother trying to worry about the personality variables that you bring to the table, other than the traps that we will talk about here, that if you're highly agreeable, we've got some work to do. If you're highly open, we got things to watch out for, et cetera. If you're highly disagreeable, et cetera, there are, if you're highly introverted, there's things that you could probably do that would be smart to make sure that you don't have your range of social universe too narrow in the modern world because you don't belong to a village that's pulling you into the dancing circle. And so there's things to look out for. But at the end of the day, we can look at the problems, the three major problems that we all face, and that is the competitive feedback that we receive from potential or existing mates, potential or existing friends, or potential or existing employers or clients. Our happiness is going to be determined by how well we are prepared and ready to display our value proposition to those three classes of individuals. If we are unhappy, it is likely that we are suffering from some negative feedback in those domains, and those domains need attention, and then they need some essentially analysis and an expenditure of energy in an intelligent fashion so that we can get better feedback, okay? Our outcomes of our lives. In fact, he may or may not have said this in his book, and he probably didn't, but the number one predictor of human happiness is how happy you are in your primary romantic relationship. That is a fact of human life, okay? And so that doesn't mean that you can't have a good life without a mate, but it does tell us what sits at the core of human beings, and that is the fundamental thing that sits at our core as an animal that reproduces sexually. You would expect, and it's a pair bond, largely pair bond oriented animal. We would expect that the recurrent esteem dynamic that would take place between us and somebody that we are very proud and happy to be with should be the number one predictor, and it is. So it would also then secondarily be a very high predictor of, are you ready to meet that person? Do you look good enough? Is your bank account good enough? Is your hair good enough? Is your car good enough? Are you well read enough? And are you seasoned enough? And have you had enough experience in screwing up? Are you ready? Okay? That if you are ready, whether or not you ever win, that readiness and a sense from your own internal audience that you're ready, that is a very important influence on your happiness state. And so we focus on those essentially competitive problems rather than worrying about trying to move around our stability as a personality factor.
Fascinating.
Okay.
This is great. Thank you very much, Dr. Lisle. We have a caller that just called in the middle of this. So let's see what they have to say. Caller, how you doing? What's your name? And where are you calling from?
I'm calling from Sherman Oaks, California. And are we allowed to, this is my first time calling in, so are we allowed to ask a question that isn't on tonight's topic, like if it's something we heard in another episode? Because I don't know what your rules are.
Absolutely.
Sure. Yeah, here's the deal.
Okay.
What's your name?
AJ.
AJ. Go ahead. AJ, go ahead and give us a question, and I'll try to answer it quickly. Give it a shot.
Okay. Right, because I literally just started listening to you guys 2 weeks ago because no one told me you had a podcast, so I've done 35 episodes in 2 weeks. And the episodes a lot of them are about women and being overweight and how, things like that and how men don't like overweight women. So my first question is if nobody was overweight in the Stone Age, how do you account for Fred Flintstone? Because he is quite overweight. That's not my real question. That's actually
it's a great question, though, AJ. Go ahead.
AJ.
Right, yeah. But my real question is now more people are overweight and obese than not, and so somebody's marrying all these overweight women, and if men really prefer thin women, how do you account for certain cultures that seem to prefer heavier women, or certain like celebrities like Kim Kardashian or Ashley Graham, the plus-size model? How do you account for their popularity if men really just want thin women when there's so few thin women left?
Well, first of all, we have to understand a number of things. First of all, the people can't always get what they want. So as a result, an awful lot of men are with an awful lot of women that they would prefer to not be with, but it's the best they could get. Okay, so right away, we obviously, trust me, if the women of the world were what it is that the men of the world would want, we know what those women would look like. Okay, they would look like very thin, pretty models, or they would be very curvy, pretty models. But that's what they would look like. And now is it? You're also going to have on the basis of both cultural and natural genetic variation, you're going to have some degree of attractiveness in women that. So in other words, there's some outlier men that are very attracted to women that are 5'5" and 250 pounds, because these are individual differences in genetics, but they're rare. In other words, and we know that they're rare for the following reason, and that is we can see that those are uncommon preferences, and we can see why it is that they're uncommon, because undoubtedly there were many men that fell in love with women that were already pregnant in the Stone Age, and they thought they were wonderful people, and they had sex with them, but they didn't leave as many offspring as the men that were very fussy about that and were looking at those women's waistlines like a hawk. And if those women's waistlines were a little too thick in the waistline, then they weren't interested. Those are far more common genes that are built into the men that we see on the earth today. So when it comes to the preferences of men and the fact that there's going to be some plus-size models, people can be overweight and be extremely attractive based on other features. But when we really look at who is starring in all of these soap operas around the world, whether they're in India, whether they're in Pakistan, whether they're in South America, or whether they're in North America or England, we know what the women look like. They all look like they're about 5'5" and about 125 pounds. And so more or less, I've yet to see, even though I hear about these supposed cultures where all the men seem to be attracted to really overweight women, I want to see a soap opera that is being shot in that culture, and you show me who the lead female is. In all the stores where I've been getting my Pakistani food, and they've got the TV on, they all look the same to me. All the women around the world that are playing the leads in these things all look the same. So I think that the story of the variation there is way oversold, and in fact the scientific evidence indicates that the variances between what we find beautiful here and what they find beautiful anywhere else, the variances are very small.
Wow.
Okay?
Okay.
All right. Good enough.
AJ, thank you very much for the call. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank
please
you.
call again.
I love the show. Thanks, guys. Thank you so much.
Very cool.
All right, you got it. All right, Dr. Lisle, we'll have a great week ahead of you. This is the first week of summer, so enjoy yourself, and we will speak with you next week.